Hello everyone! In this video, we'll be looking at how ambition is presented in Macbeth. Before we dive into the play, let's look at the context. In the Renaissance period, kingship was thought to be divinely preordained. The ideology behind this was the divine right of kings. This theory was developed by James VI of Scotland, who, after Elizabeth I's death in 1603, became James I of England and Ireland as well. Macbeth was first performed in 1606, 1 year after the 1605 gunpowder plot, which was a failed attempt to assassinate James I and to blow up the Parliament. Coming hot on the heels of such an incident, Macbeth and its parallels to the political situation then would not have been lost on the audiences or the king. On the most obvious level, the play cautions against overreaching ambition, especially the sort directed towards the throne. In that sense, Macbeth could be seen as a pro-establishment deterrent for Guy Fawkes sympathisers or potential insurgents. With James I now as the patron of Shakespeare's troupe, renamed from Lord Chamberlain's men to the King's men, this interpretation would seem valid. In fact, this view is endorsed by the prominent Shakespearean scholar Emma Smith, who writes in her monograph This is Shakespeare, "For all Shakespeare's fascination with regime change and weak kings, and the question of what makes a good ruler, Shakespeare is here the mouthpiece for Jacobean hereditary monarchy, for his new King James, and for the Stuart dynasty safely cushioned by two young princes." The sense of moral outrage and disturbance in Macbeth is Shakespeare's invention, turning the brutal chaos of the sources into a story of rightful succession interrupted by the terrible ambitious agency of Macbeth. The terrible ambitious agency that Smith speaks of is in fact the central issue that Macbeth grapples with in the play. The protagonist's ambition is terrible because he pines after something that doesn't naturally belong to him. Ambition, like Renaissance subjects, had its time, place and limits, and so ambition of the transgressive sort can only be an unnatural and therefore dangerous desire, which, once entertained and pursued, can only result in disaster. Now let's start with Act 1, Scene 3, the moment after Macbeth and Banquo receive the three witches' prophecy. Early on in the play, we see that Macbeth already shows sign of unease about the prospect of being king. His rational self knows that to be king stands not within the prospect of belief, but to this statement he adds no more than to be Cawdor. Now Macbeth makes a false equivalence here, and this sets him on the path of his inevitable fall. If we recall the divine rights of kings theory, we know that whether or not someone can be king is coded in their DNA, and it just so happens that it's not in Macbeth's. Our protagonist is fully aware of this, which is also why he's so agonised by the witch's prophecy. We see this in his aside in Act 1, Scene 3, as he says, "Two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme." The two truths refer to Macbeth being Thane of Gland, which he already is at the start of the play, and Thane of Cawdor, which he's just found out about from Ross shortly before the speech. Note the word swelling in swelling act. This word could either mean being inflated with anger or arrogant, in the sense of swelling up with pride. On a more basic level, it literally refers to the movement of rising up. But as we all know, what rises up must come down. So this is a key moment of foreboding, which hints that for Macbeth, his imperial theme may only be a temporary stint and not a permanent station. He then goes on to say, "This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success commencing in a truth? I am Thane of Cawdor. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature?" The phrase "against the use of nature" hints at the heart of what's wrong with Macbeth's ambition. It's unnatural because it's against divine law and providential will. This is reinforced by the personification of the horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs, which suggests that by so much as toying around with the thought of being king, Macbeth's external and internal selves are disturbed. The vivid verbs are especially telling. What's fixed now becomes unfixed, the negative prefix un implying a sort of undoing, and Macbeth will eventually be undone. And the heart that's seated, originally settled in its place, now knocks at the ribs, becomes dislodged as it seeks to venture beyond its domain. But the heart can only serve where it naturally belongs in the body, and so this parallels Macbeth's station, which is only legitimate when he accepts his place in the social hierarchy, which unfortunately is not the king's throne. Now, even though Macbeth is stirred by tempting thoughts, he's still rational enough at this point to realise that kingship cannot be forced. The problem, though, is that he sees it as a possibility, albeit a remote one. And we know this when he says, "If chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir." And here's a great example of dramatic irony, because we know that Macbeth will shortly go on to stir for the crown by killing Duncan. Macbeth seems to believe that fate is a determining factor in kingship. But if kingship is to be derived from God alone, then fate or chance would seem irrelevant here. As such, Macbeth's first error is his misguidedness about the limitations of ambition and the sources of ultimate power. After Macbeth discusses the Three Witches' prophecy with Banquo, he writes to Lady Macbeth and tells her about his supernatural encounter. In his letter, Macbeth calls his wife "my dearest partner of greatness," which tells us that the marriage is a close tactical partnership with a mutual interest in power. This also shows us that whatever ambition Macbeth may have, Lady Macbeth shares in it. And sure enough, after Lady Macbeth reads his letter, she reveals a side to her husband that we've not seen thus far in the play, which is quite different from the glowing characterisation we've heard in Act 1, Scene 2, where he's referred to as brave Macbeth, valiant cousin, and worthy gentleman. From his wife's perspective, Macbeth is in fact not so valiant and brave, and while the Thane may be ruthless on the battlefield, having unseamed MacDonald from the knave to the chaps, he can be quite pussyfooted when it comes to making important decisions. To Lady Macbeth, her husband's problem is being too weighed down by matters of conscience, too troubled by wanting to be morally righteous, or at least appearing to be so. As such, he's just not evil enough to get to the next level. After reading his letter, she says, "Yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Thou wouldst be great, art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it. What thou wouldst highly, that wouldst thou holily, wouldst not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win. Thou'dst have, great glams, that which cries, thus thou must do, if thou have it, and that which rather thou dost fear to do than wishest should be undone." Notice the colons and semicolons that appear as examples of midline caesura. Apart from showing the gravity of Lady Macbeth's thoughts in the moment, each pause pushes her argument about Macbeth's nature towards an inevitable conclusion, as she goes from commenting on his nature being too kind to pointing out that he has the ambition but without the illness that should attend it, and that he wants greatness but doesn't have the guts to pursue it, to finally pinpointing his fear as the quality that holds him back from achieving more. Note the syntax in the phrase, "what thou wouldst highly," which is reversed in the next line as "that wouldst thou holily." This is an example of antimetabole, which is the repetition of words in reversed order. This pattern of reversal is also evident in the phrase that follows, "wouldst not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win," with the phrases play false and wrongly win being chiasmic mirrors of each other. What this double inversion suggests is the indecisiveness and hesitation of Macbeth's mind, as he finds himself torn between two poles of tension and his mind tied up in a knot when faced with big decisions. Clearly, Lady Macbeth thinks that this should I not mindset is what's holding her husband back from pursuing greater ambitions. And here, perhaps this reminds us a bit of Hamlet's to be or not to be. Notice the polyptoton of the word do, from must do to do to undone. This could imply that Macbeth is a vacillator, someone who lacks the will to commit. He may recognise that he must do something, but once he's done the act, he immediately regrets it and wishes he hadn't done it at all. As in, thou dost fear to do, than wishest should be undone. These observations show Lady Macbeth's annoyance with what she believes to be her husband's weak-willed nature. All of this, of course, ends in her determination to pour her spirits in thine ear, which she'll do in Act 1, Scene 7 to set off the chaos in the rest of the play. Most importantly, her soliloquy shows that she is the ultimate pragmatist in the play, and that it is she who has the most sobering understanding of what ambition really is. Specifically, Lady Macbeth is aware that in order for Macbeth to be king, they must resort to illegitimate means, and that he can't have his cake and eat it too. She understands that the game of ambition is dirty, cutthroat, and Machiavellian, and so one can't be spotless in the pursuit of power. It's just the way the world is. She sees ambition as the only route to greatness, but also knows that embarking on it requires either natural cruelty or grave sacrifices in character. One of the key observations about the language of this play is the way Macbeth and Lady Macbeth echo each other's words. This is appropriate, since they're not only husband and wife, but also partners in crime. An example of this is when Macbeth considers the motives behind killing Duncan before the night's feast in Act 1, Scene 7. At the start of his speech, he echoes two important words that we've already seen in Lady Macbeth's speech just now, which are done and catch. As when he says, "If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly." Now, while Lady Macbeth emphasises active agency with her must-do and to-do, Macbeth repeats the past participle done 3 times. This validates Lady Macbeth's observation of her husband's wanting the result without wanting to be involved in the process. He's not even committed the act, and yet he already wants it to be over, done, and done quickly. Shakespeare also uses passive voice in If It Were Done to show Macbeth's reluctance in this moment. But this also looks forward to Act 2, Scene 2, when he says, "I have done the deed to Lady Macbeth," after he kills Duncan. Interestingly though, this scene of murder doesn't take place on the stage. So in that sense, Shakespeare relieves his protagonist from having to commit the regicidal act in front of the audience, and to an extent, erases Macbeth from the act. Of course, contextually, it would also have been impolitic for Shakespeare to stage a regicide so blatantly after a failed assassination against James I. The second word Macbeth echoes, catch, also avoids human agency. Whereas Lady Macbeth's comment is that he is too kind to catch the nearest way, meaning to strike at the closest opportunity, Macbeth's statement writes himself out of the catching, and instead personifies assassination as what could trammel up the consequence and catch with Duncan's success. As Macbeth continues to ponder on the judgment and guilt that one would feel after committing a grave sin, he shifts from the evasiveness of passive voice to the more philosophizing tone of a collective active voice, with we. As in, we'd jump the life to come, we still have judgment here, that we but teach but bloody instructions, which, being taught, return to plague the inventor. So perhaps the idea is that we, the audience and the reader, are not exempt from these dangerous musings, and Macbeth's indecision over whether to kill Duncan or not is not so different from our own hesitations in moments of overwhelming temptation. In fact, the only occasions when we do see first-person I in his soliloquy is when Macbeth makes his most innocent statements. I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. And I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. It's significant then that when he does mention ambition for the first time ever in this play, he immediately reverts to personifying mode, as he claims, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. Notice that he says my intent, but he doesn't say my ambition. So ambition has been personified as this wayward creature, rising and falling on its own accord as it overleaps itself with an agency of its own. It's hard not to see the word vaulting as a pun on the word fault as well, in which case the phrase would mean sinful ambition, which in the context of this play is apt. So by externalizing ambition as a separate being, Macbeth seems to be arguing that whatever sin he next commits out of ambition is, ironically, out of his hands and control. As we reach Act 3 of the play, we're likely to feel a stronger sense of pathos for Macbeth. Part of why we feel bad for him is that we see he realises power doesn't bring joy, nor does ambition offer peace of mind. After Macbeth becomes king, he finds out that his ambition extends beyond the realm of his rule. He can't bear the thought of having Banquo's son succeed him, especially when he has no son of his own. Interestingly, he knew this to be the case when he first heard the witch's prophecy on the heath, but it wasn't until he became king that this turned into an issue. This suggests that ambition knows no bounds, that ambition begets ambition. We see this moments before Macbeth orders Banquo's murder, when the newly minted king reflects on the flimsiness of his fruitless crown. He says, "There is none but he whose being I do fear, and under him my genius is rebuked, as it is said, Mark Antony's was by Caesar." The allusion to Mark Antony is both ironic and foreboding. It's ironic for Macbeth to compare himself to Mark Antony, because unlike the latter, who was loyal to his leader Julius Caesar, Macbeth had betrayed King Duncan. The reference to Octavius Caesar rebuking Mark Antony foreshadows Macbeth's own imminent loss of power. Octavius, also known as Augustus, was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and as such is more of a rightful successor than Mark Antony. It's interesting as well to consider that James I succeeded Elizabeth I not as a son, but as a relative. It's also telling that the second triumvirate, formed by Antony, Augustus, and Lepidus, was ultimately broken up and triggered a civil war partly because of the men's competing ambitions, and partly because of Cleopatra's influence over Mark Antony, which is not unlike Lady Macbeth's sway over Macbeth. This ominous allusion is followed by the imagery of infertility, as in the phrases a fruitless crown, a barren sceptre, and an unlineal hand. These descriptions are examples of hyperlage, also known as transferred epithets, which basically means an adjective which qualifies a noun other than the person or object it is actually describing. So for example, a crown can't literally be fruitless, but instead it is Macbeth, the person wearing the crown, who is fruitless because he has no son. Likewise, it isn't his sceptre that's barren, but rather his own sterility, or Lady Macbeth's infertility, we're not sure. Most ironically, the real unlineal hand isn't so much Fleance's as it is his own, since Macbeth was the one who had wrenched King Duncan's throne away, being this unlineal subject with no royal blood. This imagery of lineage and succession is reinforced by the parallelism of for Banquo's issue, for them, and only for them. And this reminds us that order and inheritance are the essence of rightful kingship, which is a station that one must be born into, and that no amount of ambition or scheming can grant. Meanwhile, the forced juxtaposition of the hyperliges also draws attention to the unnaturalness of Macbeth as king, and to his status as an outsider who can only observe but never truly be a part of this line of kings. And this distinction prepares us for the final apparition that Hecate and the Three Witches conjures up when a procession of 8 kings, followed by Banquo's ghost, haunts Macbeth in the form of a horrible sight and accelerates his descent into murderous paranoia. And that's a wrap, guys! If you find this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel for other GCSE and A-level English literature videos. Make sure you check out the blog post for this in the description box below. And finally, leave a comment to let me know what you're studying and what else you wish to see from this channel in the future. See you soon!